Hi, Jesse with eTrailer. Today we'll be taking a look at and I'll show you how to install the DeeMaxx disc brake kit with electric over hydraulic actuator on our 2017 KZ Sidewinder. We're seeing more and more people wanting to switch from their drum brakes to disc brakes. There's a ton of reasons. I mean, obviously we don't see a lot of cars getting made anymore with drum brakes. It's just a better, newer technology. It's going to promote better cooling for the braking system, more consistent, steady stops, and it's actually going to perform better, so it's going to stop faster and keep you safer out there on the road. Not only are the brakes going to perform better, but they're also going to be much easier to maintain. There's going to be less parts to worry about, they're easier to replace, and also a nice thing is you can just check through the wheel, look at your pad life. Instead of with a drum brake setup, you would have to remove the wheel, take the drum off, which includes taking the outer bearing off. Then you can see the life of your shoes. This one you can just bend over, or maybe while you're checking your tire pressure, check your pad and make sure you're okay. Another nice thing about this DeeMaxx kit is the hub and rotor comes as a one-piece assembly, as opposed to other styles where they have a slip-on rotor that will go over your hub assembly. It's a much better design. The hub and rotor one-piece assembly will keep any dirt or debris from getting in between and getting trapped in the bearings. And that just means less maintenance and less worries while you're out there on the road. Also, the rotor on the DeeMaxx is vented, as you can see. There's cooling fins in between the two rotor sides. And that's just going to promote better cooling. Your rotor is going to stay cool, and also your brake pads. And one other great thing about this DeeMaxx, in my opinion, is instead of rigid, hard lines, the entire brake line system is this rubber hose, which I think is a lot easier to install. You don't have to worry about kinking it as much. It's a lot more flexible, and it just makes the process go way more smoothly. So this DeeMaxx kit comes with this actuator here, which is made by Deutsch HydroPro. It's a G1600 alpha, which means that it is capable of up to 1600 psi, and it gets to that 1600 psi very quick. The actuator itself is made of extruded aluminum, and we have ours wired into this breakaway battery here. This one's made by Brightway Group. This is a good option for you, but we do have many other options available here at eTrailer. Couple things to check just to ensure that this fits on your trailer. You need axle capacity of at least 7,000 pounds, and your lug pattern needs to be 8 on 6.5. All in all, if you're looking to improve the braking and just the all-around ride of your trailer, you can't go wrong with this DeeMaxx kit here. The pads themselves are actually made of Kevlar, so those are going to hold up great. And the rotors and calipers have DeeMaxx's own max coating, which they've put through strenuous testing. They've done salt spray testing with them, so you know they're going to hold up. They're going to work fine on a boat trailer. They're tested for that, and any kind of road salt or any grime you really don't have to worry about. As far as the install goes, I'd say if you've done brakes on a car before, for the most part, it's pretty similar to that. The only exception would be hooking up the actuator. So if it's not something that you're looking to do yourself, then feel free to check out our dealer locator. However, if you do want to see how I set this up today, feel free to follow along and I'll show you how we did it. First of our install will, of course, be to take our wheel off. So I just have a 3/4 inch socket. Just go through, take all the lug nuts off. And we'll set that wheel aside. We need to get our little grease cap off. If you're planning on reusing it, I would recommend hitting on the edges with a screwdriver, but we have new ones, so I'm just gonna give it a couple taps and it should fall off. And underneath there, we have our little lock washer. Should just be able to pop that off with this flathead. And take our spindle nut off. Set that aside. We are going to reuse that. Then we have a washer, which we're also reusing. Just kind of work it off. It'll get caught on the threads. But take that off. Now with those removed, we should be able to pop off our drum assembly, and we'll set that aside. We have 5 nuts to remove. They are 14 millimeters. And once we get that last nut off, our brake assembly will slide out. And behind here, we'll need to snip our wires. We're not going to reuse these, so you can cut them back, and later we'll go in and seal up this hole here. So we'll slide our drum off. Now we need to clean our spindle up. We'll just come through and clean up all this old grease with some brake clean and some rags. While you're doing this, it's a good idea to just kind of run your finger along your spindle here, make sure there's no burrs sticking up or anything. If you do feel a burr, you can just take some fine grit sandpaper and sand it down. We'll get that cleaned up. And I also like to, while everything's off, I'll take my grease gun and pump this full of grease. I'm just looking for some new grease to come out of there. It's just easier while everything's off. You can see right where it changes to new grease from that dirty old grease. We got all that cleaned up. Now with these studs, we're actually not going to reuse them, so a couple taps with the hammer and they should pop off. Our kit comes with new hardware for this. Just be sure not to hit the spindle when you're swinging your hammer. We're ready to mount our caliper mounting bracket onto our spindle. So slide it on, and you'll see we have all the numbers facing towards us, and our caliper is going to be mounted in the 9 o'clock position. Right now we're on the passenger side. We want that caliper to be on the rear side of the wheel. So we'll take our hardware. Once we have all those holes lined up, we can slide our bolts through. I'll just get a few on there, and then I'll get a few of the nuts started on the back side. So we'll get all 5 of those hand tightened, and then we'll come back through and tighten them down. Now we'll tighten all those down with a 14 millimeter wrench and a socket. I would normally want to tighten down from the nut side, but there's no way to get a socket on the back of these, so this is the only way we can do it. While you're tightening down, just make sure everything's sitting flush. And kind of, once you get one tightened down, kind of work in a star pattern. Now we need to torque these down to the manufacturer's spec. If you don't have your own torque wrench, we do have some available here at eTrailer, or you could always rent one from your local auto parts store. Once again, I'll just do that star pattern, get all these torqued down. You will have to use the wrench on the back side. We need to pack our bearings, so I have a liberal amount of grease here, and I'll just put that in my palm. We're going to work that grease in there, just pushing against my palm until I see it come all the way out the top there. And then we'll work our way around and do the entire bearing like that. Once we do that, we'll also do that with the outer bearing. Once we have both of our bearings packed, I'll just rub some of that extra grease that's still on my gloves onto our spindle. And then also onto our hub here. Just help the seal slide in there right. We'll drop our inner bearing into place. Make sure it's sitting all the way in there. Take our seal. Make sure you get some grease around the rubber seal here and around the outside. Try to get that as centered as possible. And if you don't have a bearing installer, a little trick we found around the shop is to take one of these hole saws, flip it around, and as long as you have a nice flat surface, anything will work. But we like to use these just because we can change the diameter up if we need to. So I'll just punch this into place. Take it off. So I'm not sitting completely flush. I'll need to hit it a few more times. And we'll just need to make sure that we're completely flush all the way around, which we are now. So now we should be ready to install our hub onto the spindle. We're ready to slide our assembly into place. Just try to keep it as even as possible while putting some force on it. You may have to kind of wiggle it around. You just have to find the sweet spot because there's such tight tolerances that it will only go on one way. Once we get that seal completely seated, we can slide our outer bearing in. This also has some pretty tight tolerances, so just kind of have to work on there. If you get stuck, one thing you can do is slide your washer on, then take our 1.5 inch socket that we're going to be using to torque the nut down, and just give it a few taps, really light taps. It should go all the way in. Get that threaded on, and take our torque wrench. While we're torquing this down, we'll need to rotate the hub the opposite way. And the torquing process on these is we're really just trying to get that bearing to seal completely. And once we're done, we will back it back off. So I was rotating the rotor. You'll see that rotor's pretty tight now, so back off our nuts. It just needs to be finger tight, and just make sure that your hub still spins. We'll take our castle nut washer, line it up with the flat part, and slide it right on. We'll take our caliper with the pads installed. It should just slide right into place. And once we get everything lined up, these caliper bolts should tighten right onto that spindle. Got that one lined up there. They do have Loctite pre-installed, so they'll be kind of hard to get started, but just make sure you have some threads started before you go tightening it down with the wrench. The wrench is a 13 millimeter. Now we'll take our torque wrench and torque both bolts down. The specification is listed in the instruction, but most of the DeeMaxx stuff has torque specs printed on what you're torquing. So you should see it on the back of the caliper here. Now we'll take our grease gun and push this into the Zerk fitting on the spindle and start pumping it up. We're going to pump this until we start to see the grease flower out from the bearing there. Then I like to give the hub a few rotations and pump a little more in it. I'm just going to fill it up for now. So I see it coming out from the bearing. I'll give it a few rotations and pump a little more. We'll pop that off. Now we can install our cap. These can be kind of tricky. You just want to get it as centered as possible. Then come through with a rubber mallet and tap it on there. And we'll take our rubber seal and slide that into our middle. So we got our brakes ready here. We just need to repeat that process on all of our other wheels, and then we'll move on to getting our actuator set up and our brake lines ran. Now we're here at the front of the camper. As you can see, a large generator that's taking up most of our storage here. But the nice thing about this actuator is it has a very small footprint. So you see we have this little cubby space here. It fits perfectly back there. Depending on your setup, you may want to put it somewhere else. Just make sure that it's not anywhere where it might get hit by something. Maybe you're moving stuff around back here or something falls while you're driving. Just find a good spot where it will be safe. And then once you figure out that spot, you will just have to mark a hole where your fitting will go down. And that hole is where our brake lines will begin running out back to the brakes. Here's a look at that hole I drilled from underneath our camper. That's where our hose comes out. And then we're just running it along the frame rail here. And I will tie up some of this slack just with a zip tie later. But I just used the included loom clamps and self-tappers straight into the frame rail of the camper, all the way back until we eventually get to the axles. Once we got to the axle, I realized I had a bit of slack with the line, so I just made a loop and tied in our four-way junction here. Before I mounted the junction, I attached this hose here just to ensure that I wasn't too tight with it, and also that I'm not making contact with any suspension components. And then we tied in our hose that leads up to our rear axle here. And that's where we tied in our three-way junction. On this one, I just mounted a bracket, so I had a nice sturdy mounting point on the frame. And I did the same thing where I tied this hose on first just to make sure that I had a good mounting point, and once again, it wasn't too tight and I wasn't making contact with suspension. Both of our passenger side hoses are set up essentially the same way. I just tied off our three-way for the rear axle and off the four-way up there for the front axle. They just gave us some medium length hoses. I actually had a bit of slack in both, so I just put a bend in it to take that away. Once again, using those looms to bring it across and just finding a spot where it's not super tight and I'm not going to make contact with the leaf spring. Tightening for all of our fittings will be essentially the same. We have a 10mm flare nut wrench, and we'll just feed our hose into our caliper here. Get that spun on. And tighten it down. Just make sure when you're tightening it that you're not getting too much of a twist in any of the hoses. If you do start to get a twist, then just loosen it up and try to hold your line against the twist. We'll get that crank down pretty tight. That way we don't have to worry about leaks. We will go through once we have everything full of fluid and leak test everything, but I just like to try to get it done the first time right. So get it tightened down and do that with the rest of the fittings. Now that all of our lines are secure and set up, we can get to our wiring for the actuator. I already have ours set up. So we have our breakaway battery mounted here against the wall next to our actuator. You can mount this almost anywhere, just make sure that it's in the upright position. And as far as running the wires, we had to add a couple duplexes on and then fish them up through to where our 7-way plugs into everything. But I'll just go over the wiring real quick. So our black wire from the actuator, we tied that into our red wire on our battery box, and that's running up to our truck battery power from the 7-way. And then our white wire from the actuator and our white wire from the battery box are just grounded off right here on the chassis. Our blue wire from the actuator that runs to our brake controller wire for the 7-way. The yellow wire is running straight to our breakaway switch, which takes us to the breakaway battery here. We have our red wire running to the other side of the breakaway switch, and along with the ground and the blue wire from the battery, that's going to run straight to our breakaway switch also. So here's a view of our pin box here. This is where all of our wires were ran. So I used a fish tape to grab those duplexes where we just were with the actuator to fish them through here. And I just had to test everything, figure out what wires controlled what, and plug in our wires from the actuator and the battery box corresponding, and then mounted up our breakaway switch here. You just want to make sure when you mount it that it is in a kind of like a 90-degree angle, just so you know if there is a catastrophic failure that this will get pulled out. And I just ran those wires up here and joined everything in our box here. So I'll get this all tidied up, and then we'll do some testing. Before we do testing, I'm going to fill the reservoir with brake fluid just so we don't have to worry about that pump running dry. I filled our reservoir up with fluid and I put the cap back on. And over here we are plugged into, through our 7-way into a test box. You could also just plug into your towed vehicle and engage the brakes that way. But this is just easier because it's going to be hard if you're sitting in the driver's seat hitting the brake pedal. It's going to be hard to hear if that actuator is actually going off or not. But on our test box, all we have to do is turn it on, and we should hear that actuator pumping. And then I turn it off and it stops. So that's one way to test. And then we'll also test by pulling the plunger on the breakaway switch. Once you test your actuator, it's always a good idea to do a lap around, check and see if you have any leaks, also check all your fittings. I actually ended up not tightening this hose enough, and you can see there's a puddle underneath it and it's dripping. So I'll just tighten that fitting down. And then once we get the system bled and we have full pressure going to all the calipers, we'll also check all of our fittings then. For the bleeding procedure, we will need a partner up at the front who's going to actuate the actuator and get the fluid running through it. We'll begin on the caliper furthest away from the actuator, and whenever I open up the bleeder, I'll tell him open. He'll run the actuator. I'll close the bleeder, tell him it's closed, and then we'll do that process just until we see no more air bubbles coming through our tube, which having a tube like this is kind of nice. It kind of alleviates a bit of the mess. You could just spray this into a pan, but you might make a little bit of mess doing that. So we'll just watch our hose here, make sure there's no air bubbles, and then we'll move on to the next furthest away from the actuator. So open our bleeder up. Open.
On.
Close.
Off.
Open. Just tell me when you're ready every time.
Yep.
Open.
Running.
Close.
Off.
Once we know all the air is bled out of our system, we can double check all of our fittings for leaks and then throw our wheels back on, get them torqued down, and we're ready to hit the road. That's going to do it for our look at and installation of the DeeMaxx disc brake kit with actuator. I'm Jesse. Enjoy the ride.